Okay, if you'll look in your binders under legal issues, we'll talk a little bit about the official complaint process. And the first thing that you'll see is this lovely flow chart. So you've got that in front of you. A formal complaint has to be based on one of the charges listed in paragraph 2702 of this lovely book called the Book of Discipline. 2702 lists the following offenses: immorality, including but not limited to celibacy and singleness, not faithful in a heterosexual marriage, practices declared by the United Methodist Church to be incompatible with Christian teachings, which is including but not limited to self-avowed practicing homosexual or conducting ceremonies which celebrate homosexual unions or weddings. Crime is a chargeable offense. If a pastor gets arrested for committing a crime, that's a chargeable offense in the church. Disobedience to the order and discipline of the church, dissemination of doctrines contrary to the established standards, in other words, blasphemy, relationships or behaviors that undermine the ministry of another pastor. Those are all charges. So we can, pastors can get in trouble for things other than sexual misconduct. Child abuse, sexual abuse. There is no statute of limitations on child abuse or sexual abuse. The statute of limitations for all the other categories is 6 years. A crime or something that would be connected to sexual abuse or child abuse, any of those things, there's no limitation, which is a good thing. Sexual misconduct, including the use or possession of pornography, harassment, which includes but not limited to racial or sexual harassment, or racial or gender discrimination, or fiscal malfeasance. So clergy can get in trouble for a whole bunch of things. But very often, something that comes to the cabinet as an official complaint usually has a sexual nature to it, or the fiscal malfeasance. Those are the two most common.
And any church trial that I've ever known has always been around the sexual misconduct or the homosexuality issue. I don't know if we've ever had a church trial in the denomination.
There may, there's a possibility. Our conference is unique. I discovered when I went to training for the Committee on Investigation that some conferences routinely have 6 to 8 trials a year. We were there in like May, and somebody said, we've already had 4 trials this year. Because their bishops were afraid to do anything except send it to trial. They didn't try to do the just resolution, which we'll explain in just a moment, or dismiss cases. They just, we got a complaint, it goes to trial. We've never had bishops who've acted like that, thankfully, because they're horrendous, they're expensive, and they don't do anything to build the kingdom. They really don't. So, if the complaint involves a minor or a vulnerable adult, as soon as it reaches the bishop's ears, there will be a call made to protective services. If it hasn't already happened. We trust it already has happened, but just in case it doesn't, the bishop will always do that. So the bishop can initiate, if enough things come to the bishop's ears, the bishop can say, sometimes it's the district superintendent who writes the complaint. Sometimes it's the victim or someone who has, the victim, the survivor, or someone who has witnessed what that survivor has experienced. To make it official, it needs to say, I'd like to file a complaint. It's really helpful if it mentions paragraph 2702. We can always go back a second time and help the person write it. In the earlier case, Paul and John Paul are going to come sit and talk to the district superintendent. The district superintendent will inform the bishop. We'll talk about it as if it's a written complaint, and the written complaint will come maybe later that day or in a day or two. The bishop must inform the chair of the Board of Ordained Ministry that there has been a complaint filed and the general nature. And the bishop must inform both the complainant and the respondent of the process in writing. And our bishop does that generally when we have the interview with the persons. If the bishop feels that it is in the best interest of the church, the pastor's family, the bishop can immediately suspend the pastor for a period of 90 days with the possibility of extending it another 30. In almost every, I can't think, well, back in the old days. Currently, if the complaint is of a sexual nature, there will be a suspension. There could be a circumstance in which the pastor wouldn't be suspended, but right now I can't think of a reason. Tom?
When you say suspension, that is with pay and benefits.
Yes. Yes, they are suspended from the pulpit. They may not step foot on any church property other than the parsonage in which they live. If they have things in the church office that they need, someone will get them for them. The DS or Elaine or somebody will come in and get those things for them. They are not allowed to initiate any contact via phone, email, whatever, with anyone. As Elaine said earlier, the congregation can be encouraged to write them notes, send them flowers, do whatever, but the pastor is suspended from all pastoral duties. I don't care if there's a wedding tomorrow, the pastor is suspended. Yes?
You talk a little bit about, you said they can stay in the parsonage. Would you talk a little bit about what is extended to the family if the pastor's credentials are turned in when they live in the parsonage? Would you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. Sometimes when one of these complaints happens, it may end up that the spouse leaves the pastor. That has happened. The cabinet will find ways to support. We will find ways to maintain probably 6 months of health insurance, some kind of income for them, help them find a place to live. If they are the ones that move, if the pastor is the one that moves, then if the pastor surrenders credentials at some point, again, there's usually some kind of,
Remaining in the parsonage for so long.
yeah, you get 30 days in the parsonage, you can, and we don't just say, you're done, no insurance, no money, no nothing. But during the time of suspension, they are paid their full salary, their pension gets paid, they have their health insurance, because they are not proven guilty.
And if a pastor loses his or her credentials and they have money in pension, they keep that.
Yeah, they don't not taken
Some,
away.
sometimes that's a
Question, yeah.
misperception around that as well, that
No.
if a pastor surrenders credential, they do not lose their pension.
And those are really important things to know when we go into a congregation, at a congregational meeting, because those are questions that often get asked. Asked, you know, who's going to take care of them? Well, we do not throw them to the wolves.
Congregations are concerned about the families, the spouses, all of that. And we offer the counseling for them. We do everything we can to help. So back to the process. We get lots of tangents here, but that's quite fine. The bishop gets a written complaint. The bishop or the bishop's designee, and sometimes that may be 2 superintendents, it will not be less than 2 people meeting with both the respondent and the complainant. Quite often it will be 3. It's often the bishop and 2 superintendents. The superintendent of the person and then a second superintendent. Meet with the complainant, hear the complaint, hear whatever additional information that person wants to share at that time. The complainant is encouraged to bring someone with them, and that person can be there and be supportive and can even talk. Amazing, they're allowed to talk in that situation. Yeah. Then the bishop and the same other persons, if it's 2 DSs or whatever, will meet with the respondent. Not at the same time, and if one's coming after the other, we make sure there's no meeting in the hallway. You know, we do look out for those kinds of things. And based on that, the bishop makes a decision. And this is the preliminary decision. The bishop can say, this is a bunch of horse hockey. It's, you know, this person obviously has mental issues. It's baseless. It's out. The bishop may want some further digging before dismissing it, but the bishop can choose at that point to dismiss the complaint. The bishop could choose at that point, send it on to the Committee on Investigation and let's get the trial process going. But in the middle is that just resolution process. What's a just resolution? A just resolution is a solution to which the bishop agrees, the complainant agrees, and the respondent agrees. All 3 have to agree that this is a good way to resolve this situation. An example, the pastor who claimed he left his cell phone unattended and the neighbor sent a text message. True story. The text message actually went not to the person the pastor was intending to send it to, it went to a pastor's spouse instead, which is how we got a hold of it. So in that case, it was obvious, we had clear evidence, and none of us bought the story of the neighbor sending the text message. And we developed a just resolution, and the just resolution was that the pastor would go on leave of absence for at least 2 years. The pastor would undergo counseling. The pastor would undergo psychological testing. The pastor would meet with the district superintendent on a monthly basis. Remedial boundaries, Elaine and Betty did a 2-on-1 boundaries training. So we had all of those, and the complainant said, yes, I think that will address the situation, and I'm comfortable with that. The one thing we didn't put in that particular plan, but we've put in every one since then, any failure to do any of these will result in the loss of credentials. That person eventually did surrender credentials. We discovered after $8,000 of psychological testing that this was a predator with a moderate to high chance of reoffending. So that one did end that way because we discovered more stuff along the way. But we had that just resolution. The one case that almost went to trial was resolved by that person surrendering credentials. Because that person's wife was about to come for a hearing with the Committee on Investigation, and anything she said could have been used in the civil case that was being brought against him. So, but, you know, if you're in the trial process and then suddenly, you know, the person says, you know, I really don't want to go through this, I don't want my family to go through this, let's see if we can find a just resolution is the first thing on our bishop's mind. He wants to find a just resolution before we even have a complaint sometimes.
And a just resolution does include surrender of credentials.
Yes.
Yes.
Because we're satisfying the church through the bishop,
Right.
the complainant and the respondent. And the only alternative for some respondents, then it's either credentials or church trial.
Right.
Yeah. That we will be satisfied with nothing less than surrender under complaint.
Right, one way or another.
Yeah. Now, some people, those of you who know the discipline well, you cannot take a leave of absence if there is a complaint against you. So how do we do that? Well, if the complaint reaches a just resolution, then the complaint has been satisfied, the complaint's not there, and so you can take a leave of absence. So we do everything legally. We are very careful about process. We are very careful about making sure everybody gets their due process and their rights. If it does get referred to church trial, the church appoints a counsel who is a pastor, and there can be a co-counsel who's an actual lawyer. And then that person will write up the complaint. It goes to the Committee on Investigation. The Committee on Investigation does their work. They can hold hearings, they can interview people, they can gather all kinds of information. They're kind of like the grand jury. And if they find that there's sufficient evidence to move on, then it moves to the next stage for trial. The level of proof needed in a church trial is significantly less than in a civil or criminal case. If it's, Judge Judy says, if it's more likely than not, you know, if the evidence is such that the evidence is credible, believable, it doesn't have to be beyond the shadow of a doubt. If it looks like a duck, quacks like a duck, walks like a duck, it's probably a duck. And so that tends to give us a little leverage at times. The bishop, the district superintendents will speak frankly. If there's a pile of evidence, we'll say, you're not gonna, you know, this is pretty significant. We've had bishops who are very good at getting people to surrender their credentials when it's been appropriate for them to do that. Sometimes the charges that are brought, sometimes it's like, yeah, these are serious, but this really has to do with pastoral effectiveness. This really isn't a judicial complaint. This is really administrative. And so then it'll go back to the Board of Ordained Ministry, and we'll let them deal with ineffectiveness and those kinds of things. But we really try hard to avoid trials. And we do try very hard to come up with something that makes the complainant feel validated, heard, and really feel as though the concern was properly and appropriately addressed. If the complainant does not agree to the resolution, it's not a resolution. Sometimes the bishop will say, what is it that you need? What do you need for this to feel solved for you? So our bishop is very good at those kinds of things. The other thing I want to say, and it's been touched on briefly, you're not the investigators. The bishop, the DSs, whoever the bishop says, they do the investigating, but if something comes up, there's a section in here on conducting a good investigation. You do need to be careful about asking questions that are too leading or putting ideas in somebody's head. Let them talk, tell me about it. I think you ought to talk to the district superintendent. I think you ought to write that down. I think you need to journal that. You offer those you're not the investigators. Just like we're not the investigators with child abuse. If we suspect it, we're not the investigators. We don't make that judgment. We let the professionals do that. If the pastor happens to have been arrested, and that's how something comes to light, and it's happened, pastors have been found doing things in public places, in cars, in Walmart bathrooms, wherever. We will generally put our process on hold until the legal process takes place. And that does not mess up the statute of limitations.
Okay, that's good.
I have one question, Mary. We do not investigate. We leave that to the professionals, but if there is a case where there is a lot of question, and if we leave that to the professionals, then doesn't that have to go to the trial? I mean, who investigates a case when we're looking for a just resolution? How does the results, how does that happen? Or do we not care about the facts, we just want to have a just resolution?
Oh, we care about the facts. Yeah. If in the discussions with district superintendents and talking with the complainants, I even got a police badge for some investigating that I did. If we begin to uncover something that appears to be illegal, it will get turned over to the authorities. It absolutely will get turned over to the authorities. And if it would be something that none of us felt comfortable in pursuing further, like this is way over my head, I can't do a forensic audit of your computer. We call in people who can do what needs to be done. But no, it's not get a just resolution at any cost.
Okay, well, my question is, when it's he says, she says, then how do we discern what actually happened?
Yes, that's my question too. How does the cabinet investigate if the pastor denies that he or she is doing something wrong, and other people are saying, either we saw this or we have concerns about this? I'm aware of a case that happened a number of years ago where I was told that a number of members of the congregation witnessed behavior that looked very suspicious to them. They were very concerned about it. They went to the district superintendent, who called in the pastor, who denied everything. So what kind of options do you all have to investigate?
In that case, and in those kinds of cases, we need somebody to put it in writing and put a signature on it.
So because in that particular case, lots of people had seen smoke, but they didn't have any absolute evidence.
And nobody wrote a complaint.
And nobody wrote a complaint, then the cabinet's hands are kind of tied. You can't
Yeah.
really do anything other than meet with the pastor and ask directly.
Yeah,
And if he or she denies, then
Just
you have
like
to leave it until there's.
You can't act on an anonymous complaint.
We cannot act on anonymous complaints, and we have even had a complaint in hand, and the next morning, the complainant said, "I can't go through with this. It happened, but I'm terrified," and withdrew the complaint.
And some of those are the ones where,
And we know what we know, but we can't do a dang thing about it. And it keeps us awake at night.
well,
Oh, yeah.
and a lawyer sat with the cabinet
Yeah, I mean, we brought in,
who said, you don't really know anything then. And we can't do anything, totally tie our hands without a complaint.
Boy, that's,
So
It
long
just seems like there ought to be a way to investigate something like that and come up with other sources of evidence if you really think something awful has happened. But you're,
oh, you better believe it. We watch that very, very closely, and sometimes we find other ways of addressing it.
we have to have a written complaint.
We have to have a written complaint.
Someone say,
right.
I
Here's
have
what
concerns
happened.
about.
huh?
I have concerns about.
Yeah, or here's what happened. You can't even have someone say, here's what happened to me in the bathroom at Walmart and not write it down. That's part of our discipline policy. So we cannot do anything without that written complaint. But my question would be, and I'm just thinking of a specific situation where a person was accused of something and it was very clear that that didn't happen. And nobody, and I checked it out, but I probably shouldn't have done that because I should investigate. So my question is, how do we, I mean, that didn't happen. This person lied. So how do we deal with those kinds of, how do you deal with those kinds of situations in the cabinet? I mean, what should I do with that information that I have?
Bring it to us, we listen to it.
So I write a complaint?
Well, no, I mean, and that one was just,
I know, it was wonky, but,
it was the wonkiest ever, and every thread that was pulled led to something else that was a speed bump. And so I think that where we got unstuck was slowly using the process, working avenues of the process to say, okay, so you respondent could maybe come and show the IT guys some stuff about GPS.
Right.
And let's look at that and let me sit with you and talk to.
so that was an investigative process that
It
the
was,
cabinet
that
was
was,
doing, is that
yeah.
correct?
So, yeah, so there
Correct.
were pieces like that,
Okay.
that, like when there was a thread that we could
Uh-huh,
tug on
okay,
to, when the complainant said, I have recording of evidence. Another DS and I sat and we listened, I think 40 times to the same muffled noises that,
yeah,
I don't know what they were. But, you know, like we
okay.
so those things do
investigative.
happen.
Mhm.
And it's always walking with care.
Okay, so if the cabinet has brought evidence of some sort, the cabinet basically does that investigation on their own? Okay, that was my question, basically.
Or the bishop can call in somebody
Yeah.
to.
So that is, I just wanted to make sure that was cared for, that was my concern.
Yeah, and if somebody says, I have a concern, I don't have any proof, but I think this might be happening, and I can poke around and, well, I can get that police report. I can go down and see what that said, and I can check with the insurance company and see what that said, or, especially when we've had some concerns over money, and this happens to not be a pastor, but a preschool, and it's like, I think we really need to get a forensic audit in here. And we'll often pay for an audit to come in, and we will go where the evidence takes us. So, yeah, in the case you were talking about where there was smoke for years, and I was kept, people watched, but until somebody comes forward and is willing to say it, we can't do anything. And boy, that can be frustrating. Yeah?
I would like to help a complainant write a complaint at different times, but
They have to be willing.
they have to be
They have to be
willing.
willing to follow through.
And one of the things I think is really important, and this work happens kind of, it's kind of a fallout of the work that we do, is to be very clear that when a complaint is filed, it's honored, it's treated with, and the person who files a complaint is treated with respect and dignity, that it's not a scary thing to file a complaint.
Right,
You
right.
have to be honest, but it's not a scary thing. And I think our work really can be a fallout of that, so that people will see that in the work that we do. So I think that that's an important thing.
Now, for clarity, if somebody comes in and does sign a complaint, at that point, the process begins and the pastor is suspended within, that's what I'm asking, is that the case?
The bishop
pastor
decides.
is not suspended until the bishop meets with that pastor, which will
often be, if the complaint comes in at 6 o'clock in the evening, the bishop's going to meet with that pastor the next day, pretty much. You can't suspend the pastor without having the complaint in hand and sharing it with the pastor. This is why you're being suspended. But it will happen very quickly.
I understand, and it's rare, as we've already said, that somebody innocent, but that innocent pastor, I'm sure, is taking a lot of comfort knowing I'm the only one. So my point is, goes back to what was said earlier, what's to differentiate between a bogus complaint and a valid complaint without some kind of investigation being done.
And the suspension is, it might feel punitive, but it's not meant to be punitive, which is why salary compensation is all continued, because it's also for the protection of the pastor.
Sure.
So in the situation where we had the complaint to become unfounded, the person making the complaint was in the community and very vocal, and led me to believe that she was ready to be in worship defaming the pastor. Like coming in and interrupting worship and stopping a sermon saying, this is who this person, so it doesn't protect the pastor to
Right.
have him continue to serve.
Well, and in any case, there's no happy all the way around. But my point is, here was a pastor who was innocent, whose reputation in the community has been, just because there's been a fire, even people aren't going to remember he was innocent. They're going to remember that he was, there was a complaint against him. And that affects the kids, the spouse, and he can't go back to that church anymore.
He chose not to go back.
Oh, so even though you're suspended, if you're found innocent, you can go back.
He was invited back. He did have one more, he asked to not continue forever, but did have one Sunday, so that he could have an opportunity to say goodbye to the congregations.
Okay, but he can't go back as their
He could, but he chose not to.
Okay.
And in the conversation, I said, do you want one Sunday?
Sunday.
Because he didn't,
Right, so,
but he was offered the whole thing.
And I was
Okay.
I think I heard earlier that the bishop wrote a letter to those congregations explaining sort of what
Yes.
that it was not founded, and so
Yeah, I
that to
think
kind of
even
clear the
there-
air in the communities. So that was
And
like-
that's firm.
That's what I thought I heard
That there
earlier.
was follow-through, that's firm.
Yes.
And that particular suspension letter was written, because it wasn't somebody that we were watching that had smoke, or, I mean, that was a
And it
suspension
didn't
letter that
have
was.
a feeling of strong validity when it came.
Right, and it was a suspension letter that was written, suspension, and this is the purpose of suspension, not, there was a complaint that,
Of sexual
of
misconduct.
sexual
and
misconduct,
we're
but that was
investigating
never
that.
mentioned.
Oh,
in
that's
the-
good.
in
That's
the-
handy.
I didn't write that in the letter.
Yeah, yeah.
Because it didn't seem
Okay,
helpful.
gotcha.
It's, you know, so it was a lot of leaning into protection for the pastor, the church, and the person who's making the complaint.
So the letter that you referred to earlier here that was rather vague, that's probably the letter. Okay.
Yes, it's the second one in the.
Understood.
That one looks like mine,
I think that is yours, yes,
Yeah,
yes.
it looks like,
It's the one, it's the one Lori read too, in, Lock Haven.
okay, because Lori has one that she read in Lock Haven that had much more specific to it.
Oh, well, she sent, well, then that one didn't get put in then. I maybe sent the wrong one. Maybe I sent the wrong one to Louise, that's probably what happened.
And it is made clear to the congregations, right, that the suspension is for protection of the pastor.
Absolutely.
Yes,
Yeah,
that's in
that
the,
was
Yeah,
that's
it's
in
in
the
the
letter,
letter.
yeah.
Absolutely, and
I've heard it many times.
If you're asked to be there when a suspension letter is read, that's one of the things that's really important to keep in mind, that this is for the protection of the pastor. It's, you know, let's, you know, it's not punitive, it's for the protection of everybody.
Well,
This is really a bit of a side trail, but that particular pastor has continued to be in touch with me. I met with him this summer just to touch base. He contacted me, just wanted to update me on family. We met in person, work. More recently contacted me about serving as a reference for him. So, I mean, the whole narrative is not a happy journey. He is okay. I mean, it's not a happy ending, but
Right.
he is.
Even so, as I sit here and listen to all of this again, you know, when we go back to the beginning, we're light years away where we were 20 years
Oh, my gosh,
ago.
yes.
Yeah,
And if pastors wouldn't violate boundaries, if pastors wouldn't be creepers, we'd never have to have a.
That's right. That's right.
Creepers.
Not being creepers.
I like that technical term.
When she does boundaries
Well,
training, she
we're
ends it
three
with.
men here,
Just remember, don't be a creeper.
Don't do stupid stuff and don't be
Thank you all. This has been really helpful, I think. I think this conversation has been really educational. We didn't have this in our, in our training
Right.
program, but I think this has been really helpful
And
for.
for those who are new, this kind of conversation often happens in our meetings. when
Right,
we do
right,
meet.
right, right.
It's this kind of thing.
But to learn some of the process and some of the things and some of the emotions that we feel and some of the emotions that we discern in others. Yes, I was not going to make a speech. I was going to say that I really appreciate the give and take here. I think that is helpful in training to hear that kind of give and take, and that the conversations that we have in meetings and the struggles that we have and the struggles that congregations and, you know, all of that we've shared here.
Jumping off from where Marian started with church law, and talk a little bit about the civil and criminal law aspects of the work we do. So we're not part of those systems, but we live under them, and if you could picture 2 train tracks, and you've got sometimes 2 processes going along, but not necessarily in the same direction or at the same speed. So I put an article in that's a little hard to read. It's the institutional failure to protect within and beyond the Catholic Church. And it talks about the failures, the institutional failure in the case of child sexual abuse, highlighting the Catholic Church, but it does cite an incident at Willow Creek. Not only was the longtime senior pastor there an offender with multiple female staff, there had been a volunteer who had been involved in sexual abuse of children. So this, you know, even as Tom said, very large, very successful organizations can fail to do this work well or do it at all. So in this context, we have obviously a criminal law system that where children or vulnerable adults are involved, you know, will take action. And in those cases, I believe they do act on anonymous reports. But again, as we say, anonymous reports are next to useless. I mean, because there's very little that either the church law system or the civil or criminal law systems can do. So the more we can do to educate persons about their both church duty and their civic duty would be good. There is, to the point we made earlier, or was made earlier about helping complainants get to the point of actually putting pen to paper. There is good information on the General Church's website, and I think I put an article in there behind the legal tab, what every church member should know. It might be under one of the other tabs, but it was one of Sean's colleagues in church communications, Joe Iovino, wrote not long ago, saying, yeah, this is an awareness level that all members need to have. In order to get the perspective of where the, you know, we always used to use the, you know, us and the world, you know, so I don't like that. You know, we're all part of the world, so we'll just say the civil criminal system. The civil system has long held, now for decades, it just seems like it's only come to, you know, light recently with the Me Too movement, but it has for decades been unlawful to sexually harass or harass on a number of bases, gender, race, and others, persons in the workplace. And the U.S. Supreme Court has held that in a case in the 80s, and then upped the level of employer responsibility in cases in the 90s, which basically probably kicked off a lot of what our conferences did, which get an actual policy in place, get training in place, get notification in place. And there are some who think that the Supreme Court case and the, I guess, I don't want to say the safety it gives an organization, but the some level of protection the U.S. Supreme Court gave in its cases to organizations that put in place the policies and the training and the retraining and the internal reporting system, that there, some level of comfort, you know, was probably attained by those who said, well, we're doing this, we're doing the right thing. There was a recent article in the Stanford University Law Review saying that maybe that bar was set a little too high, because as we've seen in the Me Too movement, at least in some elements of the entertainment and media industries and in business, that bar, people couldn't get other people above them to believe them. It was going to ruin their careers to make these reports. So we've seen, you know, the Me Too movement just outing, you know, people directly into the media, which social media affords. And we've seen, probably will continue to see an increased level of civil action. And as we keep saying, we're not here to avoid civil lawsuits. But the work we do it in the way, if it's done effectively, will reduce the likelihood that somebody feels the need to just reach out directly, either into the social media or into the civil system. Because if you think the church system of how things work is, you know, kind of labyrinthian, the civil law system is very much so, and can be expensive and to all parties involved, either you know, in terms of money, but clearly in time and in emotion and intensity. And it's not necessarily going to get them what they really want. You know, monetary damages are not going to solve everyone's problems. And in some of these cases, that's why the just resolution process is there. That's not what people want. They want something else to happen. They want a recognition of the pain that was caused to them, an apology. They want someone removed so that they can never victimize someone else again. So to that end, we parallel to what we were doing in the work with sexual ethics, the safe sanctuaries policies were put in place, and we referenced those earlier. We have safe sanctuaries policies that dovetail into the system at least in Pennsylvania, of Childline, so that we have certain mandated reporters. We'll talk a little bit about that later in another section, I believe. But, so we have to respect both our church law system as well as this civil law system. I put a checklist in there from the U.S. Equal Opportunity Commission, and it's one of 5 checklists they have online, and if you get a chance, go online. And I suggest that, clearly the conference should take a run through of these just on a self-check basis. And then look at checklists, 2, 3, 4, and 5. These are in the employment context, but I think they extrapolate to the context where we are serving other persons, have volunteers and members involved. But it sets up a level of accountability for leadership, that leadership has the adequate resources to do a harassment prevention effort, has sufficient staff time for this, and has assessed their risk factors, because it's going to be uniquely different everywhere. And then based on that, has certain components in place. And then I like that they put in bonus points if you can check some boxes, such as does climate surveys on a regular basis to assess the extent to which harassment is experienced, has implemented metrics, conducts workplace civility training and bystander intervention training, and has partnered with researchers to evaluate the organization's holistic prevention effort. I don't know how far we've gotten into the bonus point categories, but I'd like to think that we're at least working toward getting the basics in place for all of what we do. We were talking a little out in the hallway. There's probably not a sufficient level of understanding among those who are in our pews, in our programs, about the expectations to which not just clergy, but that lay leadership are held. So there is a process in the discipline. I can't remember the paragraph, but it's a bit more draconian for a lay person. They can be put out.
A layperson can have a complaint filed against them, and they would have a very similar process, and they can go to a church trial as well. I don't know that I have ever heard of a complaint being filed against a layperson. However, we have had district superintendents meet with, Kathy's got one. And we have had meetings with laypersons about their behavior.
We've had to have several interventions in cases where a lay person involved in a church was charged with a crime and or convicted. And in those cases, their relationship with the church or their role in it or the connection to somebody, they're merited are going in, and those are very, very difficult. Very, very difficult. Often a well-loved person, and Tom and I did one of those in a small group in a church not long ago. It's, totally out of the blue, surprised everybody, and it was just a very, very difficult situation for everybody involved. Didn't involve a complaint because the criminal justice system had stepped in. I'll just say a couple things about record keeping and record retention. We've talked about, in the case that Mike and Wendy referenced, a way old case. And you've heard us say multiple times that the way we do things in 2018 is nothing like they were done in 1998, let alone, 1978. So in the cases where people are still holding pain and want to talk about it, in that case they're talking to a journalist about it, it may be very, very difficult to, find the records that would actually evidence how that was or was not handled in a particular situation. Now, almost everything is, transcribed or in writing, or, we've got security cameras. There are a lot of ways that records get formed. And a few years ago, the then bishop, asked that the team members not keep personal records of this, that we work toward a report that the convener then compiles based on information that's then provided, and that we not retain in our personal files information about these cases and matters, because it can become expensive if you do have to defend a case in a civil setting to merely go through the discovery process and come up with all the record production. And it's a different matter now. Of course, we've referenced cell phones and computers. Sometimes someone's not going to get their computer or their cell phone out of the church office immediately, because it is going to have to be forensically reviewed prior to being returned, because it will have evidence that may matter in the current complaint. So that doesn't mean we don't write things down ever. It's also, I think we concluded over the years, kind of impolite to write in front of people. You know, when people are telling their story, we really try to absorb it as much with our ears, and then that's one of the reasons we immediately debrief afterwards and try to relay the information that the convener, or whichever team member is serving as like the sub-convener of that intervention, then writes down and preserves it. And then that eventually we come up with an official record of what happened. What we do, again, we're not saying we're investigators, but sometimes evidence comes up through us. There will be a component of the church meeting that's educational. Sometimes it's educating them as to what the law is, that criminal law applies in the church too, and that here's what may happen. We talked about maybe suspending an intervention while a criminal case went on. I'm not sure we necessarily have to do that. We'd want to be working with the conference chancellor, obviously, and working with local law enforcement. They might actually like the opportunity to come and speak to a congregational meeting, especially if this was children.
We suspend our judicial
Right,
process,
right.
but
Yeah.
this team does not suspend the process.
Right. So we might actually want to invite someone from local law enforcement to talk about how to talk to your children to see if this happened to them. Things may have happened not just to one victim. And we're always aware of that when we do this in any setting. There could be multiple victims, and even though one person signed a complaint. Anything else? Oh, just wanted, in case you're following the current events on the Catholic Church, there is a debate in the legislature, which only has about 9 days left of session before it's going to call it quits for this session. But we have the Speaker of the House talking about perhaps a 2-year window to allow victims of, child sexual abuse, not just clergy child sexual abuse, but child sexual abuse in general, to bring civil lawsuits. There's a disparate view in the Senate. The Senate pro tem believes that to be an unconstitutional thing to do, but we'll see how that plays out. But there's significant pressure. Right. You're right. Pennsylvania currently, you have to sue before the victim turns age 30, and limits criminal prosecutions before the victims turn 50. And there's been some real controversy about whether that's fair as a matter of public policy. And of course, if you have any feelings about that, feel free to write to your state representative and/or senator and tell them.
And election day is November 6th. Yeah. I'm just saying. Oh, you may.
Just a couple things that have been floating around in my head. When we talk about surrender of credentials under complaint, what that means is that person no longer has any clergy status, and if another judicatory, if the pastor said, well, I'll go be a Lutheran pastor, and they would contact us, we would say that person surrendered their credentials while under complaint. And so that another judicatory, another denomination would be aware of that. With local pastors, while the discipline does say that they can go to trial, my guess is that would only happen if it were really, really on the fence whether that person were guilty or not. If it looked to the cabinet and the bishop that that person is guilty, they can be discontinued as a local pastor at any time. So it's not likely that that would go to trial, but there could be a case where man, we just don't know, and we really need somebody else to make that decision.